encounters in John. So the idea of the talk tonight is just to get a sense from John's Gospel, some of the encounters that we see in Lent, and I would describe them as cosmic and intimate. It's this combination of aspects of God, which are two sides of two extremes, if you like. And if you're, to some extent, I've always been a believer, but when, to some extent, that lovely phrase in Amazing Grace, the hour I first believed was when I was stood in my hometown, and it's a very normal hometown, and I was gazing at the sky, and gazing at the sky, its vastness, it was full of stars that night, and knowing or feeling that I was this close to Jesus, and that somehow that phrase, through him all things are made sense that night in a way that it had never made sense before. And this sense that Christ is at the center of our universe is right at the start of John's Gospel. John's Gospel begins in archein hologos, in the beginning was the Word, and this idea that all things were created through this Word. Not one thing had its being but through him. And that in that imaging of God, it's almost like we've got a new creation happening. Just as the Bible itself begins, but in the beginning, when God created when God created the heavens and the earth. What we've got is, in John's Gospel, we've got a new dawn, a new beginning, a new creation. And it's every bit as incredibly broad, incredibly vast, but also incredibly intimate, as we see from John's Gospel, which we have in a second. Right. Now, we can be daunted by the fact that there's this entire sort of incredible vastness of the earth, and this was pondered by those who believed in God back in the day, and the idea that the Torah predated or was prior to the scriptures began to make sense for the people. The idea that there was a plan for God's creation, and that this, because as anybody knows who's even put up a kind of lean-to in the backyard, you kind of need a plan before you get the actuality of something. And so the idea that the whole of creation was, if you like, predated or sort of prefaced by a creative action of God, by a plan of God, was there in the gospel. It's in the Gospel of John. This idea that before all things, anything came to be, everything was present, if you like, in the mystery of the Word that was to be made flesh. But verse 1:14 hints that this plan, if you like, came to be not in theory, not in possibility, but in actuality, in one who became flesh. And that sort of idea that God became flesh, if you like, becomes the central idea of John's prologue. John's prologue comes to its climax when it says that, and one, this word, through whom all things are made, becomes the image of God. Now, those of you who know your Bible will know that the people were forbidden to make an image of God. The is God, Yahweh, was not to be defined by an image because obviously the likelihood would be that we'd get the wrong image ourselves, that we'd make a creature of um, a bull, like they made a golden calf, like the people did in rebellion against Moses. But not until the presence of Jesus do we get the icon of the invisible God, as it's called in Colossians 1. The idea that Adam and Eve are made in the image of God, made in the image of God. Let us make man in our own image. Or this beautiful idea of the mortal Adam made out of soil but made out of spirit. That combination was made in the image of God. That God made God's self in the image of humanity. And that fragility, that vulnerability, that woundability becomes present in Christ. So what have we got in the first instance provided for by John's Gospel? We've got this encounter at the intimate level of humanity, with all our dreams, all our wishes, all our vulnerability. It's going to be imaged by God, present in Christ, in Jesus, also in humanity, in divinity, but in vulnerability. And so this beautiful mystery of God's presence among us is captured perfectly in this idea of the cosmic and the intimate, which in all the Gospels is most vivid in John's writing. Now, in John's Gospel, there's lots of encounters. I mean, there's that beautiful encounter at the beginning with Nicodemus, you know. I'll never forget that song. I don't know if people sing it these days, but I've got that Nicodemus newborn feeling down in my heart. You know, this idea of meeting at night, always in John's Gospel, beautiful contrast between light and dark. And when things start to be, you know, happening in secret, they're happening in the dark. But John keeps trying to pull things into the light. We have the lovely image of the Cana, the miracle at Cana, where the water is turned into wine, and the steward knows about it. He's the first to see this happen, but others don't know about it. But what I want to focus in on is John 4 for a few moments. So think about the woman that is met, that Jesus meets at the well, the Samaritan woman. Now, you may or may not know that wells are unusual places in the scriptures because they were one of the few places where women were allowed out, if you like, to gather the water, etc., or do washing, etc., etc. They were one of the places where romantic encounters could take place. If you look at the Old Testament, you'll find that Isaac meets Rebecca by a well. There's Jacob meets Rachel by a well, and Moses meets Zipporah by a well. Hence the saying, where there's a well, there's a way. They were quite romantic places. And so you've got Jesus meets this woman at a well. It's a romantic context. And you know, the disciples are not going to be too pleased when they find Jesus talking to a woman, especially a woman of somewhat dubious repute at a well. Now, what we find in this encounter between Jesus and the woman at the well is that gradually, it's a bit like confession. She gradually sort of digresses things, you know, building up to the biggie. Well, no, actually, I've had 5 partners, and I'm not married to the latest one I've got. You know, she's somewhat of a, what's the word, she's not got a clean track record here, or not, maybe clean's not the right word to use, a straightforward track record. And yet, in talking to Jesus, she comes to terms with who she is, She comes to terms with who he is. And there's almost a mutual a mutual discovery happening here, such that she becomes, this dubious woman, becomes a witness to Jesus. And so in this exchange, these exchanges about herself, she finds it within herself an ability to witness to who he is. In discovering herself, she can acknowledge who he is. And so she's no longer hiding, and in that context he is revealed. And I think it's a beautiful ending to that gospel. The disciples are still cross with her, but she becomes a witness to her people. Now, there are other incidents that take place. We have the lovely story of the man at Bethesda who is brought to the pool. He can't get to the pool, and he's blessed and he's healed. And it's beautiful little the paralyzed man, if you like, becomes agile under the word of Jesus. But the one I want to focus on is the next one I want to focus is another woman. It's the famous story of the woman caught in adultery. We don't have much evidence of Jesus being a writer of any kind. It gave us memorable things to hear, many of which are in John's Gospel. But we have this wonderful scene. I think we heard it only last Sunday. This idea of the woman who again is unlike the Samaritan woman, she's got nothing to say for herself. She is silent through shame. She's about to be killed, about to be stoned. And Jesus, just in one phrase, stops things happening that shouldn't be happening. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And in that moment, suddenly the picture goes from looking at her and projecting all our anger onto her, all our desire for purity, and in the good sense it can be projected. In the bad sense it can be projected too. In this sense it's projected badly, such that this woman becomes an object of hatred. But suddenly that hatred is turned to self-reflection, and the people find themselves one by one leaving the scene, because Jesus, what he's done is he's made us look at ourselves and said, well, if you are to look at yourself, you cast a stone. And the beautiful image that we take away from that is Jesus and the woman left together. Again, this beautiful scene where they exchange just a few words, and she is set free. She's set free by acknowledging her sins, but not taking the consequence of them. Like, acknowledging her sins, yes, but not taking the due punishment. That is what Jesus does with all of us. I mean, we talk a lot about salvation. You know, essentially, Jesus is saving us from ourselves. He's saving us from who we are. The next scene I want to focus on is this beautiful scene. Now, you might not think this is beautiful at all. I once went blind. I got hit in the face momentarily for a few hours. I got hit in the face by a football, and that's what I saw. It wasn't black, it wasn't dark, but it was vacant. It was grey. It was like the TV had gone wrong. And if we move to another scene in the Gospel, the man born blind, his vision of life was dark or grey at best. And in this picture we have this wonderful scene whereby Jesus asks him to do what Um, uh, I think it was Fulton Sheen. I remember listening to old talk about Fulton Sheen talking about a theandric action, and this idea it was part God, it was part divine, part human, just like any sacrament is. In this sacramental exchange, Jesus asks the man to he rubs a paste in the man's eyes, uh, made of just like Adam's made of, if you like, the red soil mixed with the Spirit of God. So we have this new life is going to come about through this. Man washes this from his eyes, and he begins to see again. Nobody can believe it. Even his parents dumbfounded, somewhat dumbfounded. And everybody is asking, why on earth has this taken place? And taken place on a Sabbath. And you have a beautiful scene in this encounter where gradually the lad himself, the man himself, is pushed more and more to witness to this Jesus, even though he doesn't know who it was who healed him. And he was blind after all when he encountered Jesus. And the Pharisees are more and more agitated. This man must be a sinner. Who cured him? What's going on? It's a Sabbath. And eventually it's Jesus that finds this man. Jesus who finds the man who was formerly blind. And in that exchange, the man realizes that Jesus is the one whom the prophets have spoken about. He is the one who is the one who will save Israel, the one who has been promised to Israel. And so you get a blind man who comes to faith, who is illumined with faith, and yet to the bitter end, he's fighting with the Pharisees who do not see what's happened. They just see the rule being broken, and they end up in a darkness, refusing to acknowledge that this is a work of God, and instead living in this kind of grey life, this life that does not acknowledge the wonders of Jesus. I remember one Lent, I went through John's Gospel line by line, and I couldn't believe how many arguments there were. You know, because I always had this picture of John's being the most mystical and beautiful Gospel, but it's full of contention, because whenever there has been something beautiful happen, there will always be contention afterwards. I'm sure, Father Mark, you will have found this. The minute you do the most wonderful thing in the parish, there'll be some comment that will caustic comment that will come. It is the way of things. But what we find in this particular is that the man who cannot see becomes a witness, and those who can see fail to see. And you know, when we see this gospel as, if you like, an exercise in witnessing, we see that man who was born blind becomes a pivotal figure. Now, we could talk more about that wonderful exchange, the truth will set you free, etc. But I want to move on to another encounter, that encounter with Lazarus. And that beautiful scene when Jesus delays, he's called to go and see his friends in Bethany. And he hears that his friend Lazarus is ill, but he doesn't go, and Lazarus dies. And the weeping of Jesus at the scene, you know, as many people know, is the shortest biblical verse. But it's an interesting idea of Jesus weeping at the death of his friend. I had 5 sisters, and all of them practiced the faith, but one of them didn't. She was a bit of a rebel. She lived in a double-decker bus, so she was an actress. But she came back, and she was just hanging around with a friend who persuaded her to go to listen to this speaker. Some of you may have heard of Francis Hogan. And Francis Hogan did this talk on raising of Lazarus. And when, it's interesting, when my sister heard Francis Hogan speak about Jesus crying, she realized the humanity of Jesus, and that began her own conversion. She's ended up as a Carmelite nun, and she's been in there for quite a while now, a few decades. So I think it kind of took. but what I want to say is that there's that sorrow among his friends about the death of his friend, and then the wonderful scene then of Martha and Mary, they're pleading with Jesus, but when he says, roll back that stone, and there's one guy nearby who says, don't do that, because it's been a few days now. He stinketh. He'll smell badly. And they still go ahead. There's nothing more, if you like, earthbound than death, or a reminder of our own mortality than the way that we fall apart so quickly in our mortal state. But I think even more tellingly are the words that Jesus says, unbind him. They say, that's why I like this picture of Lazarus, still bound, rising from the idea of death being something that binds us and is claustrophobic to our hope, but from which Jesus, in the days of the resurrection, days that we will celebrate soon, he conquers too. Beautiful encounter. The next scene I've got is, it is an encounter, but it's one that I think we probably move over to quickly. I dug it out for you. Has anybody still got cassette player? Because I've got some cassettes here. Raymond Brown on the Gospel of John, cassette. I don't know how many cassettes. This feels like there's loads anyway. And the thing that I remember from listening to all these tapes, I can only remember one thing, and that was Raymond Brown saying that in John's Gospel, there's no Eucharistic discourse, the Eucharistic liturgy in the same way as we get in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We have a Eucharistic discourse in chapter 6, which talks of I am the bread of life, etc. You remember that. And then where the other Gospels have their Eucharistic discourse, we have in John's Gospel, we have this wonderful scene of the washing of the feet. And Peter famously saying that he doesn't want his feet washed, wash every other part of him. And in fairness to Peter, wash every other part of me. To wash someone's feet was to become unclean oneself, because this is what feet would have looked like after a hot day in a desert place, dusty. You don't know what you might have picked up, etc. But the action of Jesus to wash the disciples' feet, that action of service, Raymond Brown just speculated that he wondered whether by the time John got round to writing his gospel, that people were already forgetting that the message of Eucharist was one of service, that people would see and not forget that in Eucharist it was to be a sign, if you like, of what they would be, servants of one another, servants of the lowest of one another. The idea that the greatest will become the servant of the least. And too often, in a way, we so easily fall out of that way of thinking and fall into the world's way of thinking, whereby the greatest among us becomes the most, the one who is served most, who is honoured most, etc. Whereas the only garment that it talks about Jesus putting on in the Gospels is the apron. Now you think of the people in this world who wear aprons. You think of the people who wear aprons, put on a uniform of service like that. They're the ones who, if you like, are wearing the garments of Christ. And it's a beautiful image that Christ is the one who wears the apron. The robe, if you like, is taken from him. Now, just quickly now, because I know partly partly our own fault. I accept that. We haven't got lots of time. You might wonder why I've got Columbo there. Well, you may have thought of this before, but it's just one way of. You, you may have heard the um, passion accounts 10 times. You may have heard them 50 times. It doesn't matter. But one way of thinking about these passion accounts, and indeed the whole of John's Gospel, I talk about it being a gospel of a cosmic reality, but an intimate reality. But in a way, it's set up a bit like a crime drama. Crime dramas remain one of the most popular ways, popular forms of theatre, of TV, etc. And the reason is that everything comes into focus, and the issues are talked out in a place like this. But you are the jury in this case. All the evidence has been put before you in the gospel, and you're the one that is to make the decision. And what's happening in John's gospel is a gradual build-up. These witnesses. The Samaritan woman becomes a witness. Why did she become a witness? The woman caught adultery becomes a witness. But the lame man becomes a witness. Gosh, a blind man can see better than the ones who can. What's going on here? A dead man becomes a witness. So the if you like, the tension is building, and then we get John's sense of drama, if you like, culminates with Pilate, supposedly, of course, is a man who's in power. The sun's gone down, and now I can't see this in my living room here, over in Staines. But what do we have here? We have these exchanges between Pilate, supposedly the ruler, and Jesus, supposedly the condemned man. And when Pilate is saying to Jesus, putting the questions to him, and Jesus says, all who are on the side of truth, listen to my voice. And Pilate says, what is truth? You're screaming at the TV, as it were. You're screaming. You're looking at him. You're looking at the way, the truth, and the life. You're looking at someone who brings that, if you like, epitomizes, lives out, it incarnates what it is to be true. By contrast, Judas has gone off to betray Jesus, and it was night. Jesus is betrayed by the forces, if you like, of darkness. But all those who are on the side of truth listen to his voice and are not afraid of the light. Well, I presume I don't have to worry about spoilers. You know how this story ends. There's the John's Gospel. It's so beautiful that we still read that Passion on Good Friday. It never fails to move me. It's still beautiful. But on Easter Day, what we get, well, okay, let's just quickly go through that Passion and think back to how the Gospel started. It starts in the beginning, was a word, etc. You get then a reprise of Genesis, a reprise of Eden in the Passion account. You get Jesus arrested in the garden. He's taken outside, if you like, he's taken outside the city. That's where, instead of a tree of life, they find a tree of death for him. The bread of life is thrown on a tree of death. It's the Passover deliverance of of bread and wine, if you like, suddenly the Passover is reversed, where the blood and water flow from his side. And what we get then on Easter Day is a beautiful image where Jesus has been put in a new tomb. And this is the first day of the week, so it's the 8th day. And we don't get man looking for a woman. In the scriptures, we have the first words of the human being are a love song. Love, they're a rap. I don't know if you like rap songs, but bone from a bone, flesh from a flesh. That's rap. That's Hebrew rap. But we will find, if you like, in ourselves that music stays with us longer than any prose. And if I asked you to remember something from 1980, you wouldn't. But if I asked you to sing the song that was number one or something, you'd probably be able to do it word for word. We get in this new garden, in this unused tomb, in this place that has been not used before. We get a difference. We get a woman looking for a missing man. Whereas we had Adam pining for a partner, we have a woman pining for a partner. She calls Peter and John, and they come, and they go back, and yet she's there. She's still there. She's still crying, and someone who she thinks is the gardener. And if you notice this wonderful picture here depicting Jesus, has he got grass coming from his lips there? I don't know. It's a bit of the dark, but this idea. They've taken my Lord away, and we don't know where they put him. And then Jesus is able to speak to this Mary Magdalene. Now, she used to be a woman of disobedience, like Eve, if you like. But here she obeys the word. She stays close to the empty tomb. She's looking for the risen Lord. And when he says, Mary, she hears her name pronounced, she recognizes who is speaking to her. Rabboni, my master. So you get this beautiful image of the man back in a garden, back able to recognize each other, and powerfully, of course, in recognizing Jesus as the gardener. She's recognized Jesus as every man. Jesus is the new everyone. Creation has a new chance, a new start, an 8th day. And in so doing, we find new hope for ourselves, but for everyone in this new creation. So these encounters that we have, Jesus says, do not cling on to. You cannot cling on to this life, but you can cling on to this hope. And this idea that we now have a hope that cannot be diminished by death or our own decrepitude is actual, it's powerful, it's enduring, it's forever. Because the promise is for us. The promise of eternal life is for us. And if you take the beginning, it talks about eternity, and in the end, if you like, it talks about eternity. What is the challenge for us? Will you be a witness? Will you be a witness? Those blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. That we too are challenged to become witnesses to this encounter with Christ. An encounter which is an encounter with immortal life. Right. I'm going to stop my share there.